Hey there, grade 7s. So we got another math tutorial video here for you. Today we are going to be looking at finding circumference, and we're going to find it using the diameter, and then later we're going to find it using the radius. Remember, circumference is the length of the outside of a circle. It's basically the length of a circle itself. It just uses regular units, and if you want to remember it this way, I always like to say circumference is like the knight of the round table because he's circumference. So we're going to be finding circumference using the diameter over here. To do this, we're going to need a special tool. We're going to need to use pi. Now pi is this symbol over here. It's spelled as pi. It is a number that goes on infinitely. It does not repeat itself. As far as we know, it never comes to an end. It is 3.141592 and goes on and on and on. And you can fill chalkboards with it. You can fill papers with it. It will continue moving forever and ever. As far as we know, there is no ending to it. It's a very special number that comes in really handy, especially when we're working with circles. For the sake of today's assignment, and in most assignments that you'll be doing in grade 7 and in grade 8 math, pi will be 3.14. So this equal sign, as you know, is wavy. It's a roughly equal sign. So we're going to say, for the sake of these assignments, that pi is equal to 3.14. You should be careful when you're doing assignments that involve pi. Sometimes you might see pi is equal to 3, or sometimes it might be equal to 3.1415. But most assignments, most of the time, pi will be equal to 3.14. How are we able to find this number that goes on and on and on like this forever? Well, what we did is, essentially, we measured out the length of a circumference, and then we divided it by a diameter. And the number that came back was this one. And we found it to be true of all circles. No matter what, if you take that circumference, you divide it by the diameter, equal this thing. That meant that we can use this thing to find one of the two of them if something's missing. So for today's assignment, the first part is going to be looking at how to find diameter. The second part is going to be about finding circumference using the diameter. The second part is going to be about using radius to find the circumference. So let's go into this first question here. We need to find the circumference. We have the diameter. The formula for doing this is circumference equals pi times diameter. So the circumference is the thing I want to find. It's the thing I don't know, so it just stays as C. It says in the assignment that we're going to use 3.14 for pi. So I'm going to replace the pi in brackets with 3.14, and I'm going to replace the diameter with 20, like that. So what we got here is 3.14 times 20. Now, if you are using a calculator, of course, you can jump straight over to the answer. The answer for this one would be 62.8 centimeters. Now it's centimeters because that was the unit that was for the diameter. And I have the same kind of units when I'm finding the circumference. So because this is centimeters, then this answer is centimeters too. And it's pretty straightforward. Basically, you take that diameter, which was 20, you multiply it by pi, which is 3.14, that gives the answer. And when you're allowed to use a calculator, you can just punch it in that way. You remember from our earlier decimals math unit that we could, of course, solve this without using a calculator. To do that, we first pretend that there's no decimal places here at all. We would do 314. We'd multiply it by 20. And then we would move across the page. 0 times 4 would be 0, 0 times 1 would be 0, 0 times 3 would be 0. That was not too bad. We're going to move over to multiplying this 2 next. We move one spot over. That means I have to place a 0 here, so I'm lined up with the 2. 2 times 4 will, of course, be 8. 2 times 1 will, of course, be 2. 2 times 3 will be 6. I can add these together now. I end up with 6280. In my original question, when I was multiplying these, this had no decimal places. This has 2. So in total, I have 2 decimal places. 62.80 or 62.8. So even if I go without a calculator, I can get to the same answer here. So sometimes in this math unit, you'll be allowed to use a calculator. Sometimes you won't be. It's important that you're able to do it both ways. So here we have another circle. Once again, we want to find the circumference using the diameter. So what we do is we don't know the circumference yet, so that stays as C. We can multiply it by pi, which for this assignment is 3.14. And then we can multiply it by the diameter, which in this case is going to be 34. 3.14 times 34 give us an answer of 106.76. But remember, I'm not quite done yet. I'm missing something that's important. My diameter's units was yards, so my circumference units will also be yards. So 106.76 yards is how long the circumference is. So if you took a piece of string and it went all the way around the circle, that string, when you straighten it back out again, you could measure it to be 106.76 yards. Now, sometimes you don't have a diameter to work with. Instead, you have a radius. In that case, we have to remember that it takes 2 of that radius to make a diameter. So instead of doing circumference equals pi times diameter, what we can do is we can multiply it by 2. We could do 2 times pi times radius, because 2 of these would basically be the same thing as a diameter. So we can stick it into here. So I have a radius this time. I got 8 for it, so I don't know what my circumference is. That's still C, that's the mystery. Of course, I know what 2 is. 2 is 2. We're using 3.14 for pi, and the radius is 8. So I can now multiply these 3 numbers together. What I get for an answer will, of course, be 2 times 3.14 first. So that's going to be 6.28. And now I can multiply that by 8, and that's going to give me an answer of 50.24. What are my units? Well, I have to go back and look at the radius. Millimeters, so this will have to be millimeters as well. And that's how I'm able to figure it out. The same units that are on the radius is the same units as the circumference. So that's how long that outside the circle would be if I straightened it out to a straight line. I've got one more over here. Once again, I have a radius, not a diameter. So I'll be using this formula. Circumference equals 2 times pi times radius. And again, the reason there's a 2 and an r here is because 2r is the same as a diameter. If you would prefer to write it like this, it might look more familiar to you because that's the same spot the diameter was in. But in math, we usually put the number in front and then any symbols come afterwards. So that's why it is that's written this way instead of being pi and then 2r afterwards. Plus, the order that you multiply things in never matters. It still gets you to the same number. So like 2 times 3 and 3 times 2, of course, get you to the same thing as does 2 times 3 times 4 or 4 times 3 times 2. So back to this question here. We've got the circumference that we want to find. So that one we still don't know. We know we're using the number 2. We know we're using 3.14 for pi. And we know the radius is 7.4. We can first do 2 times 3.14. So that's again going to be 6.28. And now we can multiply by 7.4. So we're going to do 6.28 times 7.4. That's going to give us an answer of 46.472. What are my units? In this case, it's inches. So there we go. I now have my answer for what the length of the circumference would be. One final note before you start in on today's handout. Make sure that you know if you have a radius or a diameter to work with. When you are finding the circumference based on radius, you can use this formula here. When you are finding the circumference based on a diameter, make sure you're using this one here. And if you had to choose one to memorize, this is the one that is most commonly used. This is one that's easier to memorize. You could always turn your radius into a diameter first and still use this one. So this would be the one I would recommend, that circumference equals pi times diameter.